Hang on. I'll be right there. Technology. Precepts incense, samadhi incense, wisdom incense, liberation incense, liberation of views incense, cloud of lighted incense pouring into the Dharma realms, offering to the highest teachers of the 10 directions. I respectfully bow to the incense cloud Bodhisattva. I respectfully bow to the incense cloud Bodhisattva. I respectfully bow to the incense cloud Bodhisattva. I respectfully bow to all directions of space, all realms, past, present, and future, all Buddhas, the honored Dharma, the enlightened Sangha, the permanent three treasures. I respectfully bow to our own teacher, Sakyamuni Buddha, the future born Maitreya Buddha, great wisdom, Manjushri Bodhisattva, great practice, Samantabhadra Bodhisattva, Dharma protector Bodhisattvas, Buddhas and Bodhisattvas assembled at the great holy mountain. I respectfully bow to the great love, great compassion, Amitabha Buddha of the Western Paradise, great compassion, Avalokiteshvara Bodhisattva, great power, Siddhikarma Bodhisattva, great power, Mahastama Prada Bodhisattva, all the Bodhisattvas in the great pure ocean. Okay, well, good morning. So I'm going to talk about emptiness. Emptiness is one of the key teachings in Buddhism. It's actually equated with enlightenment in some forms in some schools, or the realization of it is. But anyway, it's a little difficult to talk about. And I'll get into that in a little bit. But so I was on a retreat one time, and it was a Zen retreat, and the Roshi, which is the Japanese word for Zen master, was giving everybody a koan to work on. And koans, for those of you who don't know, are these little stories that are sort of problems to solve. They're not meant to be solved logically, but more through direct experience. And the first one that everybody gets is called Joshu's Mu, M-U, Mu. Mu is a Chinese word, sort of like not. It's not no exactly, it's kind of a negation. Anyway, Joshu was this famous Chinese master, and one day a troubled monk approached him wanting to ask for his guidance, and as Joshu was talking to him, a dog walked by. And the monk asked Joshu, does the dog have Buddha nature or not? And he had barely completed his question when Joshu shouted, "Moo!" So that's the koan. So Joshu wasn't saying that the dog doesn't have Buddha nature. The koan is not, does the dog have Buddha nature? All things have, dogs have Buddha nature. The whole premise of many schools of Buddhism is that all beings are headed for liberation. And that's possible because all beings have Buddha nature. So Buddha nature is the seed of Buddhahood, the potentiality for awakening, and that's present in all beings. So the problem isn't the koan, isn't about whether or not the dog has it, but about why Joshu said moo. And I can't tell you the answer. There's not one right answer. To solve the problem really kind of requires you to let go of the idea that questions and answers about our spiritual lives need to make sense to our intellect. So, and that's kind of the way to approach the discussion of emptiness also. It doesn't have to make sense intellectually. Anyway, once in a while, someone will talk to me about Buddhism and they'll say, well, I understand Buddhism's not a religion, so more like a way of life. And this is a mistake. Buddhism is a religion, but the religion is a way of living, a way of living an enlightened life. And every religion is a way of life, or should be. I mean, I'm not an expert on Christianity, but I think if you're a Christian and you're not trying to live like Christ, then you're kind of missing the point. And I think there are a lot of Christian ministers who would say similar things. So this is what Mu really was about. In order to really enter a spiritual path, you have to transcend some of the intellectual concepts in order to live the life. And that doesn't mean that we need to submit to blind faith or something like that. We can keep healthy skepticism and continue to learn intellectually, but at the same time, we find that wisdom and knowledge are not the same thing. And we stop relying so much on knowledge and start trusting our wisdom more. So rather than staying attached to ideas about Buddha nature, we let go of those concepts and we try to live our Buddha nature. Dogen, I'm digressing here a little bit, but Dogen, the founder of Soto Zen, pondered the question of, if we all have Buddha nature, why do we have to try so hard to wake up? And he came to the realization that when we practice, that is Buddha nature. So anyway, you might wonder, well, what does all this talk about Buddha nature have to do with emptiness? And this is one of those words that we run into when we're reading about Buddhism, and it can be kind of confusing. The confusing is partly because the term emptiness itself is used in different ways to mean different things, different kind of related ideas, but also it's a practice that's better, it's a concept that's better practiced than pondered. A great Thai meditation master was talking about emptiness once in Ajahn Chah, and he said, if you try to understand it with your intellect, your head will explode. It's probably an exaggeration, but it's not easily understood intellectually. And I think Dogen kind of had the right idea, when he was talking about this being something that we practice with. So all that said, we're gonna ponder it. We're gonna talk about it with words, because I don't really have a way to do anything other than that in this particular format. So during services at White Sands and other places, we often chant a sutra that is really all about emptiness, the Heart Sutra, the Heart of the Great Perfection of Wisdom Sutra. What that means is the heart, the important teaching, the core teaching of this much longer sutra about the perfection of wisdom. Anyway, it starts like this. Avalokiteshvara Bodhisattva, doing deep prajna paramita. In other words, practicing, understanding perfect wisdom, for lack of a better term, perceived the emptiness of all five aggregates and was freed from pain. O Shariputra, form is no other than emptiness. So he's talking to Sariputra, the Buddha's one of the Buddha's key disciples. Form is no other than emptiness. Emptiness is no other than form. Form is precisely emptiness. Emptiness is precisely form. Feelings, perceptions, cognitions, and consciousness are also like this. O Shariputra, all things are expressions of emptiness. And it goes on to far beyond all such delusion, nirvana is already here. All past, present, and future Buddhas live in this wisdom and attain supreme perfect enlightenment. In other words, realization of wisdom, recognizing wisdom, is supreme perfect enlightenment. So I find this sutra very poetic. You're not going to get it on first reading or even hundreds of readings perhaps. But if you approach the sutra like the koan I was talking about, kind of the best way to understand it is to try to put it into practice. And so in a way, you make sense of it without expecting it to make sense, which I'm sure doesn't make any sense. But if you put it into practice, you'll start to realize the results of that. So you don't need to know everything in order to be able to practice it a little bit. And once you start practicing a little bit of it, it will start to open up to you. So the sutra says that Avalokiteshvara, this bodhisattva of compassion, perceived emptiness. So what does it mean to say that something is empty? So I have a prop and a glass of water. If I drink the rest of the water, I could say, look, my glass is empty. But if you're being very observant, maybe a little sarcastic, you could say, no, it's not empty. It has air in it. And I'd have to agree that it's not empty of air. So when we talk about emptiness, we have to ask, but empty of what? What is not present there? So we could agree the glass is empty of water. If we put it in a vacuum, we could agree the glass is empty of air. We could sterilize it and say it's empty of microbes and so on, right? So one use of emptiness in Buddhism is as an approach to meditation. And in that sense, we're really talking about the mind being empty of disturbance. And the Buddha explains this in a dialogue that he had with Ananda. They're staying in a monastery, and the Buddha starts out by saying that in this monastery, there are none of the disturbances associated with the village. So there were no elephants wandering around, no gold trade, no crowds of people, and so on. So the monastery was empty of the disturbances associated with those things. And so a monk meditating there only has to contend with the lesser disturbance that comes from living in a monastery. And then if he wants to, that same monk could go out into the wilderness, which is empty even of the disturbances associated with having other monks around, and just deal with the disturbances that arise from being in the wilderness, which might not seem like a big deal. But I have an old friend, a Thai monk named Tan Rongsan, and he's the abbot of a monastery somewhere now. I'm not sure where he is these days, but he spent a lot of time in a forest monastery, and he's a very serious meditator. He's one of these guys who'll meditate all night and stuff like that. And so he was talking one time about being outside doing walking meditation in the forest in Thailand, and realizing that a tiger was watching him. And understandably, he got nervous. He said, I could smell it. I could tell by the smell that it was a big tiger, but I couldn't tell by the smell whether or not it was a hungry tiger. He was afraid that if he ran, the tiger would chase him and attack him. So since the tiger was just watching him do walking meditation, he figured he'd just continue and walk, and whatever happened, happened. And so he abandoned his concerns about the tiger. So even though there was a tiger there, he was empty of disturbance about that. So in the wilderness, a monk could even set aside and empty himself of any disturbance about the wilderness and concentrate just on the nature of earth. And the Buddha is talking about this to Ananda. And he says, then the mind is empty of everything disturbance related to the earth. You can become empty of earth disturbance and concentrate on the infinitude of space, become empty of that, of disturbance about that, and focus on the infinitude of consciousness, and so on, until you realize that anything at all that is fabricated is inconstant and thus subject to suffering. So letting go of that and entering into a state of pure emptiness, the monk could find release. So the Buddha is talking about that as a way of liberating the mind by becoming empty of all disturbances. And then there's emptiness as an attribute of existence, which is what Avalokiteshvara was talking about in the Heart Sutra. It says the Bodhisattva was deeply absorbed in the penetration of understanding. And so while meditating, using his insight to discern the nature of reality, he observed the five aggregates and found them equally empty. And finding them empty, he was freed of stress. So a lot of you have heard me talk about the five aggregates before, but I'll do it again. We generally think that we have a self, and we tend to think that the self is sort of a thing separate from other things that has some sort of intrinsic reality. So we have this sort of inherent me-ness. But the Buddhist view is that what we think of as a self is really a compound of other compounds, aggregates. The Sanskrit word is skandhas, the Pali word is khandhas, which means heaps. So in one heap, we have form, which is a pile of elements. There's water and solid stuff that comes out of the earth, like calcium and iron, and things that come out of the air, like oxygen. And then there's combustion, which animates us all. So form is a heap of things that are measurable, testable, have some conventional reality. You can look at them and say, yes, this exists. And then there are formless aggregates. So there's feelings, things that feel pleasant, that feel unpleasant, things that feel neither pleasant nor unpleasant. There are perceptions. That's what happens when the mind comes in contact with form. So your ears, which are form, come in contact with the waves that travel through the air between us, and your ears and nervous system communicate that to your awareness. So that's perception of sound. And then your conditioned mental formations interpret that, identify what the sound is. So you hear words and you can judge them good or bad, or boring or interesting or whatever. And then your consciousness is aware of all this stuff going on. And so those aggregates are constantly changing. Just as this form is constantly changing, formless aggregates are also constantly changing. And so I might think this is my body, but the body isn't mine. If it were mine, it'd be, prettier, and it would hurt less when I get up in the morning. It's really just a process that's subject to causes and conditions. And so Avalokitesvara looked at form, feeling, perceptions, fabrications, and consciousness, and he said, none of this is self, it's empty of self. In other words, he realized that what he had been attaching to, clinging to his self, wasn't really what he thought it was. And then he said, oh, Sariputra, all things are expressions of emptiness, not born, not destroyed, not stained, not pure, neither waxing nor waning. And so all things, not just myself, but everything is inherently empty of self. And at that point, he transcended all suffering because he was no longer clinging to self. There was no longer any suffering to arise. He had realized his oneness with all causes and conditions. And then he goes on to say, all things are expressions of emptiness. So not only am I not really self, but everything else is empty of self too. So I have a book. Consider this book. Okay. This is called the Four Buddhist Books in Mahayana. And it's basically, I use it a lot for when I got to talk about Pure Land Buddhism, because it has kind of the meaty stuff from the Pure Land Sutras. So it's useful. And I look at it today and I see a book, and you see a book because I've showed it to you, and you say, oh, look, there's a book. But there's a lot of different things that had to be in place before this book could be here. So trees, obviously, books are made out of paper. Paper comes from trees or something like that. Maybe other paper that also came from trees or various kinds of rag content and things like that. In order to exist, trees and the cotton that they use sometimes and that kind of thing has to have water and sunshine. So that's in there too. There was a translator, and there were people who compiled these sutras way back when, and then somebody who wrote all that stuff down. In this particular case, there's an editor, a publisher, all of these people that had to be there. So they're all sort of in this book. They had to be there in order for this book to be here. So the book in this form is dependent on them. It arose dependent on all these other things, trucks and truck drivers, right? All this stuff had to be in place before this book could be here for me to point at it and talk to you today. But it also requires us as well. To be what this book is, to me, requires my perception of it and all of the mental formations and cognitions that go along with that. I see this, to me, it's a good book or a source of wisdom. Somebody else might see it as a boring book or a confusing book. Somebody might see an evil book. For this book to exist, in the sense that we think of it existing, it requires our mind also. So, it's all very interesting, I'm sure. But at what point does it stop becoming kind of an interesting intellectual exercise and become something that's actually spiritually useful to us? Well, one of my favorite Buddhist teachers, the Theravada monk, Thanissaro Bhikkhu, says something I think helpful when we approach concepts like emptiness. He says we can measure our wisdom by the extent that we can get ourselves to do things we don't like to do, but that we know will lead to happiness, and to the extent that we can refrain from things that we like to do, but we know lead to harm. So if we follow that train of thought and see this teaching on emptiness and where it can lead us to happiness, or how it can stop us from doing harm, then that could be pretty useful. There's another term you see in Buddhism, interdependence. So in essence, interdependence says that for one thing to be, something else also has to be. So we couldn't remove the tree from the book, or the sun, or the rain, or the author, or generation after generation of teachers, and so on. If you removed any of those things, the book wouldn't be there. There are a number of discourses where a monk realizes when this is, that is, when this ends, that ends, and is suddenly enlightened by this realization. In fact, the Buddha talks about that as one of his realizations. So in this particular case, Avalokitesvara realized that suffering came from attaching to one's own sense of self, and from thinking that other things had inherent existence independent of perceptions, and when that attachment ended, stress ended. So we tend not to like letting go of our idea of self. We don't see letting go of things that we think will bring us pleasure as being something that we really want to do. But the realization of emptiness of phenomena became the emptiness realized as various forms of suffering are abandoned in meditation, and as ways we can abandon the forms of suffering as they arise in life. And so this is where the idea of oneness comes in. We realize when we look carefully at what we think of as self, that there's no separation between myself and other selves. And so that realization requires us not just to know what the Heart Sutra says, but to live it, become one with it, right? And then armed with the wisdom of emptiness and oneness, we can transcend much of our suffering. And at that point then, realize our Buddha nature to some extent. So you don't have to be a Buddhist to be a Buddha, to have Buddha nature, by the way. Buddha nature is just one's true nature, one's true purpose. Your Buddha nature is your authentic self, free from grasping and clinging to ideas like self and other. There's a koan where the master says, show me the face you had before your parents were born. So, ponder that one for a while. I mean, that's kind of a way of finding what is my purpose that transcends this space and time, this particular place. So, sometimes at a party, somebody will say that they're Jewish on their mother's side and Cherokee on their father's side or whatever. And then a lot of times it becomes, well, I'm French and Swedish and Inuit or whatever. It goes on with people trying to become kind of exotic, right? Where they came from. But you can beat them all. You can say, well, I'm part tree, part grub worm, part Mack truck, part rainbow. And when people look at you crazy, you can explain that you're interdependent with all those things and a lot of other stuff too. So how do you practice this? How do you make this useful spiritually? It's interesting to think about. Is there something you can do that really makes this valuable? So I'll show you how we can become one with each other. So in Buddhism, we do this thing called gassho. It has other words, but gassho is the Japanese word. It refers to this gesture here. It's Anjali in India. I'm not sure what it is in Vietnamese. It's considered a form of respect, but it's a gesture representing oneness. One palm symbolizes subject, the other is the object. You might gasho to the Buddha, to your parent, to the teacher, to the spouse, or whomever. It not only represents gratitude and respect to them, but oneness with them. So through gasho, the dualism, the artificial separation we impose with names and labels, is transcended into the true nature of oneness. You can see it that way. So next time you gasho to somebody, feel this as you and them coming together. Just use your hands, two hands come together in one gesture. That gesture represents your oneness with the other person. So when I gasho to the Buddha, I am being one with Buddha. I gasho to you, I am being one with you. You don't really gasho with your hands, that's the outward expression. But the real gasho is done with the heart. So if we gasho to one another now, when we gasho with our hearts, then we are one. When we realize oneness, we acknowledge our Buddha nature. So I hope this was useful to you. Don't try to just get it with your head. Practice with that for a little while. Gasho once in a while. Things like that, and you'll find this useful to you, I hope. I'm going to look now and see if you've had any questions. If you have any questions now, I'll go ahead and type them out. I don't see anything at all in chat. Nothing. Can't tell how many people are watching. Well, I'll talk for a couple more minutes just to remind you that Wednesday night we have services together on YouTube. Thursday evening we have a Zoom meeting. If you've got questions that you really want to discuss, that's a good time to join us because they can be very conversational with those Zoom meetings. They typically last about an hour. We're reading the Dhammapada together, so we'll talk about a couple of verses, and I get the backstory on those. And then I just kind of open it to whatever. And so we often get really good conversations going there. So I don't see any more questions. That's fine. I hope you enjoy your Sunday. And yeah, enjoy your Sunday. Hope to see you Wednesday or Thursday. Oh, I forgot the dedication. Goodness me. Buddha nature pervades the whole universe, existing right here now, and offering flowers, candles, and incense, hearing the Dharma and training the mind. Great merit is attained. We dedicate this merit to the great Master Sakyamuni Buddha, Honored One, the all-pervading and everlasting three treasures, the 16 guardians and all protectors of the Dharma, and their relations throughout space and time, to all ancestors of this Sangha and all beings in the Dharma world. May penetrating light dispel the darkness of ignorance, that all karma be resolved in the mind flower bloom in eternal spring. May the Dharma body maintain strength and health, and years of life be lengthened for all teachers of this Sangha. May their vows be fully realized. May they live in perfect peace with Buddha Dharma. We pray for all those suffering from violence, and those who grieve for them, for those living in oppression, for all who are imprisoned who should be free, for all refugees from violence, hunger, and catastrophe, man-made or natural. We pray for the health and well-being of those suffering from diseases of body, mind, or spirit, those working toward the healing of those afflictions. We pray for those suffering from COVID-19 and those working to protect and treat them, and for those grieving, to those lost to this pandemic. We have members of our congregations, friends, and loved ones suffering from disease, and others who are grieving for lost loved ones. We pray for them and send loving thoughts their way. May they all be serene through their troubles, and may we realize the enlightened way together. All Buddhas throughout space and time, all Bodhisattva, Mahasattva, Mahaprajna Paramita, Bow to the Buddha. And to each other, Gasho. Thank you.